A batch of newly released emails reveal that Dr. Anthony Fauci was in discussions with Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg about the social media company's COVID-19 information hub.
In an email dated March 15, 2020, Zuckerberg offers to help get the message out and suggests Dr. Fauci make a video for the hub. Joining us now to discuss, Glenn Greenwald. Glenn, welcome to Rising.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So on the one hand, I feel like Mark Zuckerberg reaching out to Fauci, he's actually being the responsible one in that party. This is what we tell people to do, reach out to authority, reach out to public health officials to help disseminate accurate information. I don't know. What do you make of these revelations?
I mean, I think the problem is that, like everything COVID related and pretty much everything else, this has been put into this polarized binary framework where you either have to view Anthony Fauci as some kind of unprecedented historical monster or view him as this heroic public servant doing his best to save Americans and humanity from a deadly virus. And I think clearly the truth lies in the middle, as it so often does. I don't have a personal problem in the example you asked me with Mark Zuckerberg on his own reaching out to Dr. Fauci to try and inform himself as a CEO or as a citizen or a human being about what best to think about the virus, about the pandemic. The problem I have is that there were clearly narratives that Dr. Fauci was presenting as being definitive or conclusive or highly likely that in private he was suggesting were anything but. And the question about the emails between him and Mark Zuckerberg are most interesting to me because social media ended up playing a big role in restricting the debates that we were permitted to have about the pandemic based on proclamations of certainty from people like Dr. Fauci and the World Health Organization that proved to be completely unwarranted. And I think that's really the scandal, is not that there were clear answers to these questions that Fauci knew and lied about, but that the level of certainty that the scientific community had about these questions was nowhere near what they claimed. And the result of that was that we were barred from openly and discussing it, at least on the internet.
I completely agree that that's the point here. And there are some key redactions that seem to speak loudly, and we don't know entirely what they're speaking loudly about, but I think some of these redactions are telling. And the Zuckerberg conversation in particular is interesting given that Facebook just reversed its own stance on what you're allowed to post about the origins of the pandemic. So Glenn, my question to you then, and you have an incisive tweet, by the way, that we should put up on the screen that I want to get your thoughts on. Government demanded Silicon Valley censorship a political speech is tyrannical and intended to prevent power centers from being questioned or challenged. Now, break that down for us in the context of what we learned yesterday as these Fauci emails were sort of parsed through by journalists.
So I think this is starting to take on a generational contour. This debate is, if you're over, say, 45 years old, you have the experience of having lived, say, the first half of your life without the internet, and the internet became a technology that emerged in the middle of your life. And if you go back and look at what was being said about the internet, the promise of it was that it was going to be this unique human innovation because it was going to liberate us from centralized corporate and state control. The entire internet, as it was first conceived of, was defined by freedom from institutional authority, freedom from centralized control. And that was why the internet was so exciting. And I think that's why a lot of people who are older are kind of horrified by the idea that the internet has now become this tool of coercion used by power centers to either monitor us or surveil us or control discourse and debate. Whereas for younger people who grew up with the internet and with the corporatization of the internet, that level of control was already there, so it seems normal. But the idea in the mid-1990s or in the early 2000s that we were going to have our public debates on the internet restricted and controlled by what institutional authority says is or is not true or is not permissible speech was unthinkable. And yet that's exactly the point that we've arrived at, largely because journalists have taken the lead in demanding that ideas they think are hateful or views that they think are untrue be prohibited.
And I'm an old person too, so I remember these debates, and particularly around net neutrality. the argument on behalf of net neutrality then was that, look, if you say something that the major corporations disagree with or runs up against the consensus view, then these major corporations will be able to throttle your blog. It'll be harder for you to get your view out to the public. And that was, all you had to do was say that, and everybody then understood, okay, that is not something that we want to happen. But now they don't throttle and do it kind of subtly. Facebook came flat out and said, you cannot talk about this lab leak in any way other than this particular way. And I do want to talk about that in particular because I think that all of this is important, but also what's underneath it, the actual question. It's one of those issues where the media debate is interesting, but what's under it is also extremely important because we may have gotten a pandemic as a result of it, and we might get another. Fauci in 2012, and we talked about this earlier in the show, wrote a paper saying that it is quite conceivable that gain-of-function research, where you make a virus more deadly and more contagious, will lead to a pandemic. He said that is possible, and we need to accept our critics' argument that that is a real risk. But, he argued, the benefits outweigh the risk. Fine, you want to make that argument, make it. But it then becomes clear why, in the wake of a pandemic, it's not the best time for him to be making that argument. So we just literally can't have the debate.
And that seems like a totally obvious problem, Glenn, but I think there are deeper reasons for why it's a problem. Okay, we lost Glenn for a second, but he's back. He's in a different location. We're good to go. So, Glenn, on that point, can you explain to us exactly why, in your opinion, it is such a big deal that Fauci had starkly different opinions, privately and publicly, from 2012 to right now, what he's saying in 2021. Why is that such a big deal? Some people might just assume it's the hypocrisy of it, but it's much, much more of a problem than just mere hypocrisy, is it not?
Yeah, it's interesting. I did a lot of reporting on the anthrax case and the FBI's repeatedly failed attempt to prove that they had discovered the person who was responsible for the 2001 anthrax attacks, which played a really big role in American political life. And what they ultimately claimed was that a scientist at Fort Detrick was responsible for those attacks. And as you might remember, the anthrax that was sent was extremely weaponized anthrax. It wasn't normal, naturally occurring anthrax. It had been weaponized. And what I learned at doing that reporting was that both the U.S. and China and other countries do lots of research where they create deadly viruses in labs. And the claim is we don't do it offensively in order to make weapons. We do it defensively. We have to create these in a lab to study how to vaccinate ourselves against them, to protect against them. But in doing so, they're actually creating dangerous viruses. So the question of whether this novel coronavirus was created in a lab, maybe for totally legitimate reasons, which is to do the kind of defensive research most major countries do, was something that Fauci, in discussions with his colleagues, was acknowledging was a very real possibility. And yet privately, he was telling tech monopolies and pretty much everybody else who would listen that the evidence was conclusive, that that it instead was zoonotic, that it had jumped from an animal species like a bat or a pangolin to humanity. And I think there's obviously a concern when any government official misleads the public, even if for good reasons. But the more important question that we have as journalists is what kind of research is being done in these labs, whether in China or the US or in joint research programs, and what are the risks to humanity from the research that's being done?
Right. And if it did escape from this lab as a result of this research, it's not as if the lab had a 40-year track record of perfect safety, but this was pretty recent stuff that they started doing. And so the warnings that people had were like, I'm not sure if this is such a great idea. If it did end up coming out of there, that means they didn't make it very long at all,
right,
from the start of their research to it actually leaking out.
Yeah, I mean, I personally would not say that I'm convinced of the lab leak theory, because I don't think we have the evidence to determine one way or the other what happened. But it goes back to what we were discussing at the beginning, which was there seems to have been a very deliberate effort to suppress the ability discuss or to investigate that. There was obviously efforts by the Chinese to prevent access to evidence, but there was also an effort on the part of U.S. officials like Dr. Fauci and social media companies to ban any discussion of that question as well. And that's the part that I continue to find most disturbing.
Right. And Glenn, while I've got you here, I've seen you're in the news again, you're trending again, and another fight with The Intercept. How long do you think this is going to go on? Is this the new kind of Mideast Crisis, or do you think there's some peace or truce in the future here?
You got to get Jared Kushner into the negotiation.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I was so happy because I had a 3-week vacation from trending on Twitter, and it was sadly disrupted by this Daily Beast article. I think we've all had that experience before where you fight with somebody on social media and it's impossible to get out of because it's so toxic, but then you sit down with them as human beings and then suddenly you realize that the person that you're fighting with is not this digitalized, pixelated monster. But when you confine yourself to social media, it's very hard to get out of that fight. It's harder, even more so, when you're trading insults through the media because you can't control when things get said, how they get said. I think both The Intercept and I are well advised at this point to realize that we both have better things to be doing than hurling insults at one another. It would probably be a relief to our audience as well if we were talking about other things besides one another. So hopefully this media cycle can end. I hope it ends, and then we can all move on to do other things.
True wisdom as always.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you so much for your time today.
All right, good to be with you guys. Thanks.
Give our best to your dogs. We'll be back with more Rising after this.